Chapter 2 of the Centaur by Algernon Blackwood. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganand. The Centaur. Chapter 2. The friendly and flowing savage, who is he? Is he waiting for civilization? Or is he past it and mastering it? Whitman. We find ourselves today in the midst of somewhat peculiar state of society which we call civilization, but which even to the most optimistic among us does not seem altogether desirable. Some of us indeed are inclined to think that it is a kind of disease which the various races of man have to pass through. While history tells us of many nations that have been attacked by it, of many that have succumbed to it, and of some that are still in the throes of it, we know of no single case in which a nation has fairly recovered from and passed through it to a more normal and healthy condition. In other words, the development of human society was never yet, that we know of, passed beyond a certain definite and apparently final stage in the process we call civilization. At that stage it has always succumbed or been arrested. Edward Carpenter, Civilization, Its Cause and Cure. O'Malley himself is an individuality that invites consideration from the ruck of commonplace men. Of mingled Irish, Scotch, and English blood, the first predominated, and the Celtic element in him was strong. A man of vigorous health, careless of gain, a wanderer, and by his own choice something of an outcast, he led to the end the existence of a rolling stone. He lived from hand to mouth, never quite growing up. It seemed indeed that he never could grow up in the accepted sense of the term, for his motto was the reverse of nil admirari, and he found himself in a state of perpetual astonishment at the mystery of things. He was forever deciphering the huge horoscope of life, yet getting no further than the house of wonder, on whose cusp surely he had been born. Civilization, he loved to say, has blinded the eyes of men, filling them with dust instead of vision. An ardent lover of wild outdoor life, he knew at times a high, passionate searching for things of the spirit when the outer world fell away like dross and he seemed to pass into a state resembling ecstasy. Never in cities or among his fellow men, struggling and herded, did these times come to him, but when he was abroad with the winds and stars in desolate places. Then sometimes he would be rapt away, caught up to see the tail end of the great procession of the gods that had come near. He surprised eternity in a running moment, for the moods of nature flamed through him, in him, like presences potently evocative as the presences of persons and with meanings equally various. The woods with love and tenderness, the sea with reverence and magic, plains and wide horizons with the melancholy peace and silence as of wise and old companions, and mountains with a splendid terror due to some want of comprehension in himself, caused probably by a spiritual remoteness from their mood. The cosmos, in a word, for him was psychical, and nature's moods were transcendental cosmic activities that induced in him these singular states of exaltation and expansion. She pushed wide the gateways of his deeper life. She entered, took possession, tipped his smaller self into her own enormous and enveloping personality. He possessed a full experience and at times a keen judgment of modern life, while underneath all the time lay the moving sea of curiously wild primitive instincts. An insatiable longing for the wilderness was in his blood, a craving vehement, unappeasable. Yet for something far greater than the wilderness alone. The wilderness was merely a symbol, a first step, indication of a way of escape. The hurry and invention of modern life were to him a fever and a torment. He loathed the million tricks of civilization. At the same time, being a man of some discrimination at least, he rarely let himself go completely. Of these wilder, simpler instincts he was afraid. They might flood all else. If he yielded entirely, something he dreaded, without being able to define, would happen. The structure of his being would suffer a nameless violence, so that he would have to break with the world. These cravings stood for that loot of the soul which he must deny himself. Complete surrender would involve somehow a disintegration, a dissociation of his personality that carried with it the less of personal identity. When the feeling of revolt became sometimes so urgent in him that it threatened to become unmanageable, he would go out into solitude, calling it to heal, but his attempt to restore order while easing his nature was never radical. The accumulation merely increased on the rebound. The yearnings grew and multiplied, and the point of saturation was often dangerously near. Some day, his friends would say, there'll be a bursting of the dam, and though their meaning might be variously interpreted, they spoke the truth. O'Malley knew it too. A man he was, in a word, of deep and ever-shifting moods, and with more difficulty than most in recognizing the underlying self, of which these outer aspects were projections masquerading as complete personalities. The underlying ego that unified these projections was of the type touched with so sure a hand in the opening pages of an inspired little book, The Plea of Pan. O'Malley was useless as a citizen and knew it. Sometimes he was ashamed of it as well. Occasionally, and at the time of this particular memorable adventure, aged 30, he acted as a foreign correspondent. But even as such, he was the kind of newspaper man that not merely collects news, but discovers, reveals, creates it. Wise in their generation, the editors who commissioned him remember when his copy came in that they were editors. A roving commission among the tribes of the Caucasus was his assignment at the moment, and a better man for the purpose would have been hard to find, since he knew beauty, had a keen eye for human nature, divined what was vital and picturesque, and had further the power to set it down in brief terms born directly of his vivid emotions. When first I knew him, he lived nowhere, being always on the move. He kept, however, a dingy little room near Paddington, where his books and papers accumulated, undusted but safe, and where the manuscripts of his adventures were found when his death made me the executor of his few belongings. The key was in his pocket, carefully ticketed with a bone label. And this, the only evidence of practical forethought I ever discovered in him, was proof that something in that room was deemed by him of value to others. It certainly was not the heterogeneous collection of second-hand books, nor the hundreds of unlabeled photographs and sketches. Can it have been the MSS of stories, notes, and episodes I found, almost carefully piled and tabulated with titles, in a dirty kit bag of green Williston canvas? Some of these he had told me, with a greater vividness than he could command by pen. Others were new, many unfinished. All were unusual, to say the least. All, too, had obviously happened to himself at some period of his roving career, though here and there he had disguised his own part in them by Hoffman's device of throwing the action into the third person. Those told to me by word of mouth I could only feel were true for himself at least. In no sense were they mere inventions, but arose in moments of vision upon a structure of solid events. 10 men will describe in as many different ways a snake crossing their path. But besides these, there exists an 11th man who sees more than the snake, the path, the movement. O'Malley was some such 11th man. He saw the thing whole, from some kind of inner bird's-eye view, while the 10 saw only the limited aspects of it from various angles. He was accused of adding details, therefore, because he had divined their presence while still below the horizon. Before they emerged, the others had already left. By which I mean that he saw in commonplace events the movement of greater tides than others saw. At one remove of time or distance, a minute or a mile, he perceived all. While the 10 chattered volubly about the name of the snake, he was caught beyond by the beauty of the path, the glory of the running glide, the nature of the forces that drove, hindered, modified. The others reasoned where the snake was going, its length in inches, and its speed per second, while he, ignoring such superficial details, plunged, as it were, into the very nature of the creature's being. And in this idiosyncrasy, which he shared with all persons of mystical temperament, is exemplified a certain curious contempt of reason that he had. For him, mere intellectuality, by which the modern world sets such store, was a value of dry bones. Its worship was a worship of the form. It missed the essential inner truth, because such inner truth could be known only by being it, feeling it. The intellectual attitude of mind, in a word, was critical, not creative, and to be unimaginative seemed to him, therefore, the worst form of unintelligence. The arid, sterile minds, he would cry in a burst of his Celtic enthusiasm. Where, I ask ye, did the philosophies and sciences of the world assist the progress of any single soul a blessed inch? Any little dreamer in his top-floor bag, spinning by rushlight his web of beauty, was greater than the finest critical intelligence that ever lived. The one, for all his poor technique, was stammering over something God had whispered to him, the other merely destroying thoughts invented by the brain of man. And this attitude of mind, because of its interpretative effect upon what follows, justifies mention. For to O'Malley, in some way difficult to explain, reason and intellect, as such, had come to be worshipped by men today out of all proportion to their real value. Consciousness, focused too exclusively upon them, had exalted them out of due proportion in the spiritual economy. To make a god of them was to make an empty and inadequate god. Reason should be the guardian of the soul's advance, but not the object. Its function was that of a great sandpaper which should clear the way of excrescences. But its worship was to allow a detail to assume a disproportionate importance. Not that he was fool enough to despise reason in what he called its proper place, but that he was wise enough, not that he was intellectual enough, to recognize its futility in measuring the things of the soul. For him there existed a more fundamental understanding than reason, and it was apparently an inner and natural understanding. "The greatest teacher we never had," I once heard him say, "ignore the intellect. Will you tell me, can by searching find out God? And yet what else is worth finding out? Isn't it only by becoming as a little child, a child that feels and never reasons things, that anyone shall enter the kingdom? Where will the giant intellects be before the great white throne when a simple man with the heart of a child will top the lot of them? Nature, I am convinced," he said another time, though he said it with puzzled eyes and a mind obviously groping, "is our next step. Reason has done its best for centuries and gets no further. It can get no further, for it can do nothing for the inner life which is the sole reality. We must return to nature and a purified intuition, to a greater reliance upon what is now subconscious, back to the sweet, grave guidance of the universe which we have discarded with the primitive state, a spiritual intelligence really, divorced from mere intellectuality." And by nature he did not mean to return to savagery. There was no idea of going backwards in his wild words. Rather, he looked forwards, in some way hard to understand, to a state when man, with the best results of reason in his pocket, might return to the instinctive life, to feeling with, to the sinking down of the modern, exaggerated intellectual personality into its rightful place as guide instead of leader. He called it a return to nature, but what he meant, I always felt, was back to a sense of kinship with the universe which men, through worshipping the intellect alone, had lost. Men today prided themselves upon their superiority to nature as being separate and apart. O'Malley sought, on the contrary, a development, if not a revival, of some faultless instinct due to kinship with her, which, to take the extremes, shall direct alike the animal and the inspired man, guiding the wild bee and the homing pigeon, and the soul toward its God. This clue, as he called it, crystallized so neatly and so conclusively his own mental struggles that he had called a halt, as it were, to his own intellectual development. The name and family of the snake, hence, meant to him the least important things about it. He caught wildly yet consistently at the psychic links that bound the snake and nature and himself together with all creation. Troops of adventurous thoughts had all his life gone west to colonize this land of speculative dream. True to his idea, he thought with his emotions as much as with his brain, and in the broken record of the adventure that this book relates, his strange passion for his temperament remains the vital clue. For it happened in as well as to himself. His being could include the earth by feeling with her, whereas his intellect could merely criticize, and so belittle the details of such inclusion. Many a time, while he stretched credulity to a point, I have heard him apologize in some such way for his method. It was the splendor of his belief that made the thing so convincing in the telling, for later, when I found the same tale written down, it seemed somehow to have failed of an equal achievement. The truth was that no one language would convey the extraordinary freight that was carried so easily by his instinctive choice of gestures, tone, and glance. With him these were consummately interpretative. Before the age of 30 he had written and published a volume or two of curious tales, all dealing with extensions of the personality, a subject that interested him deeply, and one he understood because he drew the material largely from himself. Psychology he simply devoured, even in its most fantastic and speculative forms. And though perhaps his vision was incalculably greater than his power of technique, these strange books had a certain value and formed a genuine contribution to the thought on that particular subject. In England, naturally, they felt dead, but their translation to German brought him a wider and more intelligent circle. The common public, unfamiliar with Sally Beecham's Number 4, with Helene Smith, or with Dr. Hannah, found in these studies of divided personality and these singular extensions of the human consciousness only extravagance and imagination run to wildness. Yet, nonetheless, the substratum of truth upon which O'Malley had built them lay actually within his own personal experience. The books had brought him here and there acquaintances of value, and among these latter was a German doctor, Heinrich Stoll. With Dr. Stall, the Irishman crossed swords through months of somewhat irregular correspondence, until at length the two had met on board a steamer where the German held the position of ship's doctor. The acquaintanceship had grown to something approaching friendship, although the two men stood apparently at the opposite poles of thought. From time to time they still met. In appearance there was nothing unusual about O'Malley, unless it was a contrast of the light blue eyes with the dark hair. Never, I think, did I see him in anything but that old grey flannel suit with the low collar and shabby glistening tie. He was of medium height, delicately built, his hands more like a girl's than a man's. In towns he shaved and looked fairly presentable, but once upon his travels he grew beard and moustache and would forget for weeks to have his hair cut, so that it fell in a tangle over forehead and eyes. His manner changed with the abruptness of his moods. Sometimes active and alert, at others for days together he would become absent, dreamy, absorbed, half oblivious to the outer world, his movements and actions dictated by subconscious instinct rather than regulated by volition. And one cause of that loneliness of spirit which was undoubtedly a chief pain in life to him was the fact that ordinary folk were puzzled how to take him, or to know which of these many extreme moods was the man himself. Uncomfortable, unsatisfactory, elusive, not to be counted upon, they deemed him, and from their point of view they were undoubtedly right. The sympathy, and above all the companionship he needed, genuinely craved too, were thus denied to him by the faults of his own temperament. With women his intercourse was of the slightest. In a sense he did not know the need of them much. For one thing, the feminine element in his own nature was too strong, and he was not conscious, as most men are, of the great gap of incompleteness women may so exquisitely fill. And for another, its obvious corollary perhaps, when they did come into his life, they gave him more than he could comfortably deal with. They offered him more than he needed. In this way, while he perhaps had never fallen in love, as the saying has it, he had certainly known that high splendor of devotion which means the losing of oneself in others, that exalted love which seeks not any reward of possession, because it is itself so utterly possessed. He was pure too, in the sense that it never occurred to him to be otherwise. Chief cause of his loneliness, so far as I could judge his complex personality at all, seemed that he never found a sympathetic, truly understanding ear for those deeply primitive longings that fairly ravaged his heart. And this very isolation made him often afraid. It proved that the rest of the world, the sane majority at any rate, said no to them. I, who loved him and listened, yet never quite apprehended his full meaning. Far more than the common call of the wild it was. He yearned not so much for a world savage, uncivilized, as for a perfectly natural one that had never known, perhaps never needed civilization, a state of freedom in a life unstained. He never wholly understood, I think, the reason why he found himself in such stern protest against the modern state of things, why people produced in him a state of death so that he turned from men to nature to find life. The things the nations exclusively trouble themselves about all seemed to him so obviously vain and worthless, and though he never even in his highest moments felt the claims of sainthood, it puzzled and perplexed him deeply that the conquest over nature in all its multifarious forms today should seem to them so infinitely more important than the conquest over self. What the world with common consent called reality seemed ever to him the most crude and obvious, the most transient, the most blatant unreality. His love of nature was more than the mere joy of tumultuous pagan instincts. It was in the kind of simple life he craved, the first step toward the recovery of noble, dignified, enfranchised living. In the denial of all his external flummery he hated, it would leave the soul disengaged and free, able to turn her activities within for spiritual development. Civilization now suffocated, smothered, killed the soul. Being in the hopeless minority, he felt he must be somewhere wrong, at fault, deceived. For all men, from a statesman to an engine driver, agreed that the accumulation of external possessions had value, and that the importance of material gain was real. Yet for himself he always turned for comfort to the earth. The wise and wonderful earth opened a mind and a deep heart to him in a way few other men seemed to know. Through nature he could move blindfolded along, yet find his way to strength and sympathy. A noble, gracious life stirred in him then, which the pettier human world denied. He often would compare the thin help or fellowship he gained from ordinary social intercourse, or from what had seemed at the time quite a successful gathering of his kind, with the power he gained from a visit to the woods or mountains. The former, as a rule, evaporated in a single day. The other stayed with ever-growing power to bless whole weeks and months. And hence it was, whether owing to the truth or ignorance of his attitude, that a sense of bleak loneliness spread through all his life, and more he turned from men to nature. Moreover, foolish as it must sound, I was sometimes aware that deep down in him hid some nameless, indefinable quality that proclaimed him fitted to live in conditions that had never known the restraints of modern conventions, a very different thing to doing without them once known. A kind of childlike transcendental innocence he certainly possessed, naive, most engaging, and utterly impossible. It showed itself indirectly, I think, in this distress under modern conditions. The multifarious apparatus of the spirit of today oppressed him. Its rush and luxury and artificiality harassed him beyond belief. The terror of cities ran in his very blood. When I describe him as something of an outcast, therefore, it will be seen that he was such both voluntarily and involuntarily. What the world has gained by brains is simply nothing to what it has lost by them. A dream, my dear fellow, a mere dream. I stopped him, yet with sympathy, because I knew he found relief this way. Your constructive imagination is too active. By God, he replied warmly. But there is a place somewhere, or a state of mind, the same thing, where it's more than a dream. And what's more, bless you, stodgy old heart, some day I'll get there. Not in England, at any rate, I suggested. He stared at me a moment, his eyes suddenly charged with dreams. Then, characteristically, he snorted. He flung his hand out with a gesture that should push the present further from him. I've always liked the Eastern theory, old theory anyhow, if not Eastern, that intense yearnings end by creating a place where they are fulfilled. Subjectively, of course. Objectively means incompletely. I mean heaven built up by desire and intense longing all your life. Your own thought makes it. Living idea, that. Another dream, Terence O'Malley, I laughed, but beautiful and seductive. To argue bored him. He loved to state his matter, fill it with detail, blow the heated breath of life into it, and then leave it. Argument belittled without clarifying. Criticism destroyed, sealing up the sources of life. Any fool could argue. The small, denying minds were always critics. A dream, but a damned fine one, let me tell you, he exclaimed, recovering his brogue and his enthusiasm. He glared at me a second, then burst out laughing. It's better to have dreamed and waked, he added, than never to have dreamed at all. And then he poured out O'Shaughnessy's passionate ode to the dreamers of the world. We are the music makers, and we are the dreamers of dreams, wandering by lone sea breakers, and sitting by desolate streams, world losers and world forsakers, on whom the pale moon gleams. Yet we are the movers and shakers of the world forever, it seems. With wonderful deathless ditties we build up the world's great cities, and out of a fabulous story we fashion an empire's glory. One man with a dream at pleasure shall go forth and conquer a crown, and three with the new song's measure can trample an empire down. We, in the ages lying in the buried past of the earth, built Nineveh with her sighing, and Babel itself with her mirth, and overthrew them with prophesying to the old of the new world's worth. For each age is a dream that is dying, or one that is coming to birth. For this passion for some simple old world innocence and beauty lay in his soul like a lust, self-feeding and voracious. The end of chapter 2.